I never imagined the hardest blow of my life would come from a Facebook post. "Dad, I didn't think you'd take it this personally." Those words came much later. By then, the damage had already been done. The truth reached me in the most ordinary way possible. I wasn't sitting at a wedding venue or opening a fancy invitation. I was alone in my small kitchen, reheating leftover meatloaf after another quiet evening. My phone buzzed, and a retired coworker sent me a message. "Frank, I thought you should see this." Attached was a screenshot from Facebook. There she was. My daughter, Emily, smiling in a beautiful white wedding dress, standing beside the man she'd chosen to spend her life with. Both of them looked happier than ever beneath the caption, "The happiest day of our lives." I stared at the picture for what felt like forever. Then I looked over at the calendar, hanging on my refrigerator. The wedding wasn't months ago. It wasn't even last week. It was scheduled for Saturday. Just 3 days away. And somehow, I had never been invited. At 70 years old, I'd buried my wife, survived decades of dangerous electrical work, climbed icy utility poles before sunrise, and watched too many friends leave this world earlier than they should have. None of that prepared me for discovering that my own daughter no longer considered me important enough to witness one of the biggest moments of her life. My name is Frank Dawson. For 34 years, I worked as a union electrician just outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work. Every paycheck came with aching knees, sore shoulders, and hands permanently marked by years of hard labor. But I never complained because every hour I worked had a purpose. That purpose was Emily. After my wife passed away from breast cancer when Emily was only 12, life became a constant balancing act. One moment I was learning how to braid my daughter's hair before school, and the next I was climbing power lines in freezing weather to make enough money to keep food on our table. I wasn't the perfect father. I burned dinners more times than I'd like to admit. I forgot school paperwork. Sometimes overtime made me late to dance recitals or parent meetings. But I never stopped trying. Every decision I made revolved around one simple question. What does Emily need? I rarely stopped to ask myself what I needed. Looking back now, maybe that was my first mistake. Over the years, Emily grew into a smart, independent young woman. She graduated from college, found a marketing job in Columbus, and moved into her own apartment. Watching her build a life of her own filled me with pride. I truly believed every sacrifice had been worth it. I just didn't realize that, somewhere along the way, I'd slowly become someone she no longer thought needed to be part of her biggest day. Even after Emily moved out, I never really stopped being her safety net. Whenever life threw something unexpected her way, my phone would ring. Sometimes it was a car repair. Sometimes a medical bill. Sometimes an unexpected expense she hadn't planned for. Like most parents, I didn't keep score. If I could help, I helped. About 6 years before the wedding, she called one evening with tears in her voice. "Dad, my landlord just raised the rent. I don't know how I'm going to keep up." I still remember standing in my garage, wiping grease off my hands after repairing my lawn mower. Without thinking twice, I told her, "Don't worry, I'll help until you get back on your feet." At the time, I believed those words. Until you get back on your feet. That was supposed to mean a few months. Maybe half a year. Instead, those months quietly turned into years. Every month I transferred money into her account. Some months it was $300. Other months it was $500. I never questioned it because every time we talked, she assured me things would improve soon. Just a little longer, Dad. And like every father who wants to believe his child, I believed her. Hope has a strange way of making time disappear. Years passed before I realized that temporary help had slowly become an expectation. I didn't see it happening because I never looked closely enough. Maybe I didn't want to. Then came the Facebook photo. After staring at it for nearly an hour, I finally gathered the courage to call Emily. She answered on the third ring. "Hi, Dad." The hesitation in her voice told me everything before either of us said another word. I took a slow breath. "Emily, I saw the wedding pictures." Silence. Not the kind of silence where someone is searching for the right words. The kind where they've already accepted they're caught. Finally, she sighed. "Oh." That single word hurt more than any apology could have. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't regret. It sounded like someone realizing a secret had finally come out. I asked quietly, "When were you planning to tell me?" No answer. I tried again. I kept checking my mailbox. I thought maybe the invitation got lost. Another long pause. Then she spoke. There wasn't an invitation. Those words landed harder than I expected. I leaned back in my old kitchen chair and closed my eyes. After another moment, she added, "Brandon thought it would be better if we kept the wedding small. Just close family and people we're really connected with." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Sometimes pain reaches a point where laughter is the only thing stopping you from breaking apart. "Close family," I repeated softly. A friend had already shown me every photo from the reception. There were coworkers, old classmates, distant relatives, even people I'd never met. Yet somehow, the man who had spent his entire life putting Emily first hadn't made the guest list. For the first time in years, I found myself asking a question I never thought I'd have to ask. When had I stopped being part of my own daughter's family? Emily stayed quiet long enough for me to realize she wasn't looking for an explanation anymore. She was looking for a way out of the conversation. Finally, she said, "Dad, please don't make this into something bigger than it is." Those words hit me harder than being left off the guest list. To her, this was just an uncomfortable misunderstanding. To me, it was the moment I realized I'd become optional. I didn't argue. I simply replied, "I understand." Then I ended the call. For nearly an hour, I remained at my kitchen table, staring through the window into my backyard. The old maple tree my wife and I planted years ago was beginning to lose its leaves. Funny how you notice little things when your world suddenly feels different. People often say getting older means living with aching joints, doctor appointments, and prescription bottles. They're only telling half the story. The hardest part of aging isn't what happens to your body. It's realizing that, little by little, you start disappearing from other people's priorities. You don't notice it all at once. It happens quietly. The phone rings less often. Holiday visits become shorter. Birthdays are reduced to quick text messages. Then one day, you discover your own child planned one of the biggest days of her life without you. Later that evening, my oldest friend Carl called. Carl had spent over 30 years as a firefighter before retiring. We'd known each other long enough that neither of us bothered pretending everything was fine. "You all right, Frank?" he asked. I gave a tired chuckle. "I've been better." He waited. Good friends know when silence says more than words. Eventually, I told him everything, from the Facebook photo to the phone call. When I finished, Carl didn't rush to comfort me. Instead, he said something I'd never forgotten. "Frank, stop auditioning for a place you've already earned." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're her father," he replied, "not someone applying for the job." His words settled heavily in my mind. For years, I'd been acting as though I had to continually prove my worth. Work harder. Give more. Help more. Sacrifice more. Maybe then I'd be appreciated. Maybe then I'd matter enough. The painful truth was that no amount of giving could force someone to value what they had stopped noticing. After we hung up, I walked into my small home office and opened my laptop. For the first time in months, I searched for something that had nothing to do with bills, repairs, or helping someone else. I searched for flights. A few minutes later, I found myself looking at pictures of beaches, ocean sunsets, and quiet resorts. One destination kept catching my attention. Maui. The wedding was only 3 days away. If I wasn't welcome at my daughter's celebration, I refused to spend that weekend sitting alone in my house, replaying everything that had happened. So I did something completely unlike me. I booked the trip. For once, I wasn't spending money solving someone else's problem. I was choosing myself. And although I didn't realize it then, that single decision would become the first real step toward changing the rest of my life. 3 days later, while wedding guests were taking their seats and waiting for Emily to walk down the aisle, I was standing barefoot on a quiet beach in Maui. The timing wasn't accidental. If I couldn't be part of one of the most important days of my daughter's life, I refused to spend that same day sitting in my empty house wondering why. The ocean stretched farther than I could see, glowing beneath the evening sun. Waves rolled onto the shore with a calm rhythm that somehow slowed my own racing thoughts. For the first time in years, no one was asking me for anything. No unexpected phone calls. No financial emergencies. No last-minute favors. Just the sound of the water and a breeze carrying the scent of salt through the air. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable. After spending decades solving everyone else's problems, I wasn't sure what to do when there weren't any. The resort wasn't luxurious by any means. It catered mostly to retirees, people who preferred peaceful mornings over crowded tourist attractions. That suited me perfectly. Every morning I woke before sunrise, a habit I'd never managed to shake after 34 years as an electrician. I'd grab a cup of coffee and walk along the shoreline, while the sky slowly changed from dark blue to shades of orange and gold. On the third morning, I met a man named Walter. He looked to be in his early 80s and walked with a cane, but there was still something disciplined about the way he carried himself. We started talking while watching the waves. After a few minutes he asked, "Vacation with family?" I smiled faintly. "No, just me." He nodded as if he'd heard that answer before. "My daughter's getting married this week." "Congratulations," he said warmly. I looked back toward the ocean. I wasn't invited. Walter didn't react with surprise. Instead, he remained silent for several seconds before quietly saying, "That kind of hurt leaves a different kind of scar." There was no pity in his voice. Only understanding. Curious, I asked if he had children. He nodded. 2 sons. Then he added something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Eventually, people tell you exactly where you stand in their lives. I looked over at him. "The mistake most of us make," he continued, "is refusing to believe them the first time." His words stayed with me long after we went our separate ways. For the rest of the trip, I stopped replaying the wedding in my mind. Instead, I started replaying my own life. The overtime shifts. The birthdays I rushed home to attend. The countless sacrifices that had once felt so meaningful. And for the first time, I asked myself a difficult question. Had I been helping Emily? Or had I unknowingly made it too easy for her to depend on me? That question followed me all the way back to Ohio. I still didn't know the answer. But deep down, I had a feeling I was about to find out. When I landed back in Ohio a week later, I switched my phone off airplane mode before leaving the airport. Within seconds, it exploded with notifications. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages. One after another, they filled my screen so quickly that I actually stopped walking. For a brief moment, I assumed something terrible had happened. Maybe someone had been in an accident. Maybe there had been a family emergency. Then I looked at the names. Every single message was from either Emily or Brandon. 17 missed calls. Half a dozen voicemails. More text messages than I'd received in the previous 3 months combined. The first one simply read, "Dad, please call me." A few minutes later came another. "It's urgent." Then another. "Please answer your phone." As I kept scrolling, the tone changed. "The rent payment didn't go through. Did you forget to send it this month? Dad, we really need to talk." Near the bottom was Brandon's message. "Frank, call me as soon as you can." I couldn't help noticing something. He didn't call me Dad. He never really had. To him, I wasn't family. I was simply Frank. And if I was being honest with myself, I was beginning to suspect I had also become something else. A monthly payment. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and drove home without returning a single call. For once, I wanted time to think before reacting. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and several years' worth of bank statements spread out in front of me. Retirement had given me plenty of time to organize old paperwork, but I'd never bothered adding up how much I'd actually sent Emily over the years. This time I did. Month after month. Transfer after transfer. $300. $500. Sometimes more. The calculator kept climbing. When I reached the final number, I leaned back in my chair. I honestly hadn't expected it to be that high. The total was enough to buy a reliable used car or make a substantial down payment on a small home. I stared at the figure for several minutes. Not because I regretted helping my daughter. I never would. What unsettled me was something else. None of those payments had ended because Emily no longer needed them. They had simply become part of her normal monthly budget. Somewhere along the way, my assistance had stopped feeling like a gift. It had quietly transformed into an expectation. The next morning, Emily called again. This time I answered. "Finally," she said before I could even say hello, "I've been trying to reach you." "Good morning to you too," I replied calmly. There was a brief pause. Then she got straight to the point. "Dad, the rent payment never came. Not are you okay? Not how was your trip? Not even a single word about the wedding. Just the missing money." As I listened, one painful realization settled over me. She wasn't asking whether I could help anymore. She was asking why I hadn't. And for the first time in 6 years, I knew my answer would change everything. I remained quiet for a few seconds before answering. "Emily, can I ask you something?" She sighed impatiently. "What?" "When did paying your rent become my responsibility?" Silence. Not the awkward kind. The defensive kind. Finally she spoke. "What are you talking about?" "I'm asking a simple question. You've always helped me." There it was. Not gratitude. Not appreciation. Expectation. The difference between those 3 words is small on paper, but enormous in real life. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen. Every corner of that room held a memory. I could still picture Emily sitting at the table struggling with algebra homework, while I tried to remember math I'd forgotten years earlier. I remembered making pancakes on Saturday mornings, even though half of them ended up burnt. I remembered sitting in that same chair the night my wife passed away, wondering how I was supposed to raise a 12-year-old girl alone. Those memories reminded me of something important. I'd never regretted being her father. But somewhere along the way, being her father had slowly become being her financial backup plan. "Do you remember how this arrangement started?" I asked gently. "Of course." "And do you remember what we agreed?" Another pause. "It was supposed to be temporary," she admitted. "That's right." Before she could respond, I heard Brandon's voice in the background asking who she was talking to. Emily lowered her voice. "Dad, can we talk about this later? We just need to get through this month." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. The relationship could wait. The money couldn't. For years, I'd believed I was helping them build stability. Instead, I'd unknowingly become part of their monthly budget. I wasn't solving emergencies anymore. I was financing a lifestyle. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes before picking up my phone again. I typed a message, deleted it, typed another, then finally settled on something simple. Support given out of love is a gift, Emily. It isn't a lifetime obligation. I read it twice before pressing send. Her reply came almost immediately. "Are you seriously doing this because of the wedding?" Another message followed. "I can't believe you'd punish me like this." Then another. "This isn't fair." I placed the phone face down on the table. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to fix the problem. I didn't transfer money. I didn't apologize. I didn't make excuses. Instead, I walked outside and sat on my back porch as the evening sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. It felt strange. Part of me expected overwhelming guilt. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Relief. Not because Emily was struggling. No father wants that. But because I had finally drawn a boundary I'd been avoiding for years. I didn't know how she or Brandon would respond next. I suspected it wouldn't be pleasant. But deep inside, another realization had begun to take shape. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is stop protecting an adult child from the consequences of their own choices. The next few days were quieter than I expected. The constant stream of calls and text messages slowly faded. Emily still reached out, but not nearly as often. Brandon, on the other hand, stopped contacting me altogether. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't dictating my peace of mind. I started taking morning walks through my neighborhood instead of sitting inside worrying about someone else's problems. I visited a local cafe I'd driven past hundreds of times but never had time to enjoy. I even joined a small retirees travel club that met twice a month to plan short trips around the state. It felt unfamiliar, almost selfish. But little by little, I realized something. Taking care of myself wasn't selfish at all. It was simply something I'd neglected for far too long. About 3 weeks later, I noticed Emily's car pulling into my driveway. She stepped out slowly, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen her. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and her usual confidence had been replaced by uncertainty. I opened the front door before she had a chance to knock. "Hi, Dad. Come on in." She walked inside, looking around the house as if it had been years since she'd last visited. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, where we'd shared countless meals over the years. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, she broke the silence. "Brandon's really upset." I nodded. "I can imagine. He thinks you're punishing us." I looked at her carefully. "And what do you think?" She hesitated before answering. I don't know anymore. That was the first honest thing I'd heard from her in weeks. I leaned forward. "Emily, do you know how long I've been helping with your rent?" She looked down at her hands. "Not exactly. Almost 6 years." Her head slowly lifted. I didn't realize it had been that long. I don't think either of us did. I reached into a nearby folder I'd left on the table earlier that morning. Inside were copies of every transfer I'd made over the years. I slid them across the table. "You don't have to read every page," I said. "I already have." She stared at the stack without touching it. "I added everything together before I left for Hawaii." "How much was it?" she asked quietly. I told her the total. Her eyes widened. She covered her mouth with one hand, clearly trying to process the number. "I never," she whispered. "I know. You never said anything. I didn't want you to feel guilty." She looked at me with tears beginning to form. "No," she said softly. "I just never stopped to think about what it was costing you." For the first time since this all began, I wasn't looking at a daughter defending her decisions. I was looking at someone beginning to understand them. And sometimes, understanding isn't born from an argument. Sometimes, it begins with finally seeing the full picture that had been there all along. Emily left that afternoon without asking me for a single dollar. She simply thanked me for my time, gathered the papers I'd shown her, and quietly walked to her car. As I watched her drive away, I realized something had changed. Not everything, but enough. For the first time in years, our conversation hadn't revolved around money. It had revolved around truth. The following week passed without a single request for financial help. Instead, I received a short text from Emily. "Can we have dinner sometime, just the two of us?" There was no emergency attached to the message. No hidden favor. Just dinner. I replied with one word. "Absolutely." A few evenings later, she came over carrying a homemade lasagna. She laughed nervously as she placed it on the kitchen counter. "I hope it's edible." I smiled. "After eating my cooking for 18 years, I'm sure anything you made will be an improvement." For the first time in months, we both laughed. It wasn't forced. It felt natural. During dinner, the conversation drifted from old family vacations to funny childhood memories. We talked about her mother, something we hadn't done in a long time. Then Emily became quiet. She set her fork down and looked at me. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you." I waited. "Brandon and I have been arguing a lot." I didn't interrupt. She continued. "Not just about money." She took a deep breath. "I've started noticing things I ignored before." "What kind of things?" I asked gently. She stared down at her plate. "Whenever something goes wrong, it's always someone else's fault." She explained how every financial problem somehow became her employer's fault, or the economy's, or bad luck, or even mine. But never Brandon's. "He keeps saying that if you just helped us one more time, everything would have worked out." I nodded slowly. "And what do you think?" Emily thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't believe that anymore." Those words carried more weight than she probably realized. She wasn't talking only about money. She was beginning to take responsibility for her own life. Over the next hour, she admitted something that surprised me. When my monthly transfers stopped, she and Brandon had finally sat down and looked honestly at their finances for the first time since getting married. The numbers didn't lie. The wedding had been financed with credit cards. Their honeymoon had been paid for with borrowed money. Several pieces of furniture in their apartment were still being paid off through monthly installments. Even everyday expenses had been quietly piling onto debt. My contributions hadn't been solving the problem. They had only delayed it. Emily looked at me with tears in her eyes. I kept thinking your help was giving us stability. She shook her head. It was only hiding how unstable everything really was. I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept isn't that someone stopped rescuing you. It's realizing you should have learned to stand on your own much sooner. And for the first time since the wedding, I believed my daughter was finally ready to do exactly that. Over the next couple of months, our conversations slowly became more frequent. Not because Emily needed money. Because she genuinely wanted to talk. Sometimes she'd call during her lunch break just to ask how I was doing. Other times she'd stop by on a Sunday afternoon with coffee and sit on the back porch while we watched the birds gather around the old feeder my wife had once insisted on buying. It felt different. Not perfect, but real. One evening she arrived looking emotionally drained. As soon as she sat down, I could tell something significant had happened. "Brandon moved out," she said quietly. I wasn't shocked. After everything she'd shared over the past several weeks, I'd sensed they were heading in that direction. "I didn't think it would end like this," she admitted. "No one ever does," I replied. She stared into the mug of coffee, warming her hands. "We kept blaming money." She paused before continuing. "But money wasn't really the problem." I listened without interrupting. "It was accountability," she said. "Every setback had to be somebody else's fault. We never stopped long enough to ask what we could have done differently." She looked up at me with tired eyes. I finally realized I'd been doing the same thing. That confession meant more to me than any apology ever could. Growth begins the moment someone accepts responsibility without looking for someone else to blame. A week later, I found an envelope in my mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized Emily's handwriting immediately. Inside was a handwritten letter, 4 pages long. I sat at my kitchen table and read every word slowly. She didn't just apologize for leaving me out of the wedding. She apologized for something much deeper. She wrote about all the years she'd accepted my sacrifices as though they were simply part of life. She admitted she'd never stopped to consider what every overtime shift, every transfer, and every difficult decision had cost me. One sentence made me put the letter down for a moment. It read, "You spent your entire life making sure I never felt alone, and somehow I ended up leaving you to carry your own loneliness." I read those words several times, not because they erased the hurt, but because they proved she finally understood it. The pain had never been about the money. It had never even been entirely about the wedding. It was about becoming invisible to the person I'd spent my entire life protecting. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same drawer where I'd kept old family photographs for years. Not as a reminder of what happened, but as proof that people can change when they're willing to face uncomfortable truths. That evening, Emily called. "Did you read it?" I did. There was a long silence before she quietly asked, "Do you think we'll ever get back to the way we used to be?" I smiled to myself before answering, "I don't think we should." She sounded surprised. "Why not?" "Because," I said gently, "I think we're finally building something healthier than what we had before." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Sometimes, healing doesn't mean returning to the past. Sometimes it means creating a future that's stronger because you've finally learned from it. A year can change a person in ways they never expect. Sometimes it happens because of success. Other times it happens because life finally forces you to face the truth. For Emily and me, it was the truth that changed everything. Over the following year, we slowly rebuilt our relationship, not by pretending the past had never happened, but by choosing to move forward with honesty. Our conversations became easier. She no longer called only when something was wrong. Sometimes she'd stop by after work just to share a funny story from the office. Other weekends we'd have lunch together or spend an afternoon sorting through old family photo albums, laughing about memories we hadn't talked about in years. For the first time since my wife passed away, our relationship felt balanced. Emily wasn't looking for someone to rescue her anymore. She was simply looking for her father. Life wasn't easy for her after separating from Brandon. She moved into a smaller apartment, sold several expensive items she no longer needed, and built a budget that matched what she actually earned. She even picked up a freelance marketing project on weekends to pay off some of the debt she'd accumulated. None of it happened overnight. There were setbacks. There were frustrating months. But every obstacle she overcame was one she handled herself. And every time she solved another problem without depending on me, I felt proud, not because she no longer needed my help, but because she had finally discovered her own strength. As for me, retirement began to look completely different. I continued traveling with the retirees group I joined after my trip to Hawaii. I visited places I'd always planned to see but had postponed for decades because work and family came first. I started fishing again. I spent quiet mornings reading on my back porch with a cup of coffee instead of worrying about the next financial emergency. For the first time in many years, my life wasn't defined by obligation. It was guided by choice. One Saturday afternoon, Emily invited me to a small family barbecue at a local park. Nothing extravagant. Just a handful of relatives, close friends, and homemade food. When I arrived, she waved me over with a smile. "Dad," she called, "I saved you a seat." They were simple words, but they carried more meaning than she could have imagined. A year earlier, there hadn't been a place for me at her wedding. Now she had made sure there was a place for me in her life. Later that afternoon, while everyone was talking, Emily stood up to make a brief toast. She looked around before turning toward me. "When I was younger," she said, "I thought love was something people talked about." She smiled through watery eyes. "Now I know real love is something people quietly show through their actions." Then she looked directly at me. "My dad spent his entire life showing me that kind of love. It just took me longer than it should have to recognize it." The park fell silent. I felt my eyes begin to water. Not because the past had disappeared, but because healing had finally replaced resentment. Looking back, I realized this story was never about revenge. It was about healthy boundaries. It was about self-respect. And it was about understanding that love doesn't always mean rescuing someone from every mistake. Sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing the people we care about to grow through the consequences of their own choices. That lesson didn't just change Emily's life. It changed mine too.